The two words were Exhibit 1. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a family spends 32 years building a case against their own daughter, and how I spent 14 months building the only one that mattered. My name is Nadia Okafor Brennan. I am 34 years old. I run a logistics and supply chain company called Meridian Transit Solutions, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, with satellite operations in Atlanta, Dallas, and Toronto. As of last fiscal year, Meridian was valued at $47.3 million. We move medical equipment, pharmaceutical cold chain cargo, and time-sensitive industrial parts across North America. We employ 214 people. My parents, Clement and Vivian Okafor, sued me for all of it. I want to be precise about what they claimed. They didn't allege that I stole a specific sum. They didn't point to a particular transaction or document. Their complaint, filed in Franklin County Common Pleas Court on a Tuesday morning in March, alleged that the entirety of Meridian Transit Solutions was built on misappropriated family capital and intellectual property, and that as the rightful originators of that capital, they were entitled to full ownership and dissolution of my personal assets, estimated in their filing at approximately $47 million in business equity, plus $2.3 million in personal holdings. Their attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who wore the same confident expression in every courtroom photo I found when I Googled him at midnight the night before trial, summarized their position in his opening statement as follows. Everything this young woman owns was built on stolen family capital. He said it with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been proven wrong in front of someone who came prepared. I had been prepared for 14 months. Let me tell you who my parents are before I tell you what they did, because I think it matters. I think it explains, not excuses, explains how two people who are not evil in any cartoonish sense can still cause the kind of damage that takes years to name correctly. Clement Okafor came to the United States from Lagos in 1981 with a graduate scholarship and a single suitcase. He earned a master's degree in civil engineering, worked his way into a mid-level project management role at a construction firm, and spent 26 years building a reputation as the most reliable man in any room he entered. He was disciplined, exacting, and proud, fiercely, almost painfully proud in the way that men who build something from nothing sometimes are. He believed in hierarchy. He believed that success flowed downward through families the way money flowed through proper channels, from the source outward, the patriarch first. My mother, Vivian, was born in Cincinnati to a Haitian-American family that had its own complicated architecture of silence and expectation. She was brilliant, genuinely, remarkably brilliant, and had set aside a law career after my older brother Marcus was born because my father believed, and she eventually accepted, that the family's resources could only support one professional trajectory at a time. She redirected that intelligence into managing the family's finances, the household, and the social infrastructure that kept my father's career moving. She was the person behind every decision, which is partly why she could never acknowledge being behind any of them. They were not cruel people in the abstract. They donated to the church building fund. They brought food when neighbors were sick. My father coached Marcus's Little League team for 6 seasons. My mother organized the Okafor Cousins' annual reunion every July without complaint. What they were with me was consistently, systematically dismissive in a way that felt less like hatred and more like a kind of administrative error, as though I had arrived in the family filing system under the wrong category and no one had bothered to reclassify me. Marcus was the success story. Marcus was pre-med by 16, Johns Hopkins undergraduate, internal medicine residency at Cleveland Clinic. Marcus bought a house at 30. Marcus called every Sunday. Marcus was the proof that the Okafor family had made it in America. I was the one who studied logistics and supply chain management at Ohio State, which my father referred to at my graduation dinner as a degree in driving trucks. I was the one who spent 3 years after graduation working warehouse operations for a mid-size freight company, learning how pharmaceutical cold chain logistics actually functioned from the floor up, not the conference room down. I was the one who at 26 asked my parents for a $12,000 loan to cover the first 3 months of operating costs for a company I'd spent 2 years planning. My father said no. Not unkindly. He said no the way he said most things, with a kind of settled authority that didn't invite conversation. He said the logistics industry was too volatile. He said I didn't have enough experience. He said, and this is the part I wrote down in my journal that night because I knew even then I might need to remember it accurately, "Nadia, you have never demonstrated the kind of judgment that justifies this kind of risk. Not with money, not with anything." My mother said nothing. She looked at the tablecloth. I borrowed the $12,000 from my college roommate Desiree's father, a retired postal logistics supervisor named Gerald Washington, who had watched me present my business plan at their kitchen table and said, "You've already done the homework. Just do the work." I paid him back with interest within 18 months. He is now on Meridian's advisory board and plays golf with our CFO on alternating Saturdays. Meridian's first 3 years were not a success story. They were a survival story. I ran operations out of a 900-square-foot office in a shared workspace in Westerville, Ohio. My first employee was a dispatcher named Terrence who had been laid off from a larger carrier and agreed to work for below-market salary in exchange for a small equity stake. My first contract was a single pharmaceutical client, a regional biotech distributor who needed cold chain transport for a narrow window of clinical trial materials. The contract was worth $84,000 over 8 months. I stayed in that office until 11 most nights. I drove shipments myself twice when drivers called in sick for time-sensitive deliveries. I did not tell my parents how it was going. They did not ask. The few family dinners I attended during those years followed a reliable pattern. My father would ask Marcus about his practice. My mother would ask Marcus about his social life. Someone would eventually ask me something politely vague about my job, and I would give a politely vague answer, and we would all move forward. What I didn't know then, and discovered later through a conversation with my cousin Adise that I will return to, was that my parents were not simply disinterested. They had in fact been discussing my business, specifically its likelihood of failure, with relatives, family, friends, and at least one occasion, my father's former colleague at the engineering firm. My mother had apparently told Aunt Rita at the July 2016 family reunion that Nadia is playing at business and we are waiting for her to come back to reality. I was at that moment finalizing a contract renewal that would bring Meridian's annual revenue past $1.2 million for the first time. By year 5, Meridian had 12 full-time employees, 3 dedicated cold chain routes, and a contract with a national pharmaceutical distributor that generated $4.7 million in annual revenue. I moved into a proper office, I hired an operations manager, I brought on a part-time CFO who became full-time within 8 months. I did not mention any of this to my parents. This wasn't strategic at first. It was protective. I had learned somewhere in those early years that sharing good news with my family produced a particular kind of response that was worse in its way than indifference. There would be a pause, then a qualification, then a redirect toward Marcus. My father once responded to my mention of a new contract by saying, "That's fine, but you should think about what happens when these pharmaceutical companies consolidate. You'll need a backup plan." I had just told him we'd signed a $2 million contract. He did not ask the name of the client. He did not ask how I'd won it. He offered a contingency plan for its failure before he'd finished his coffee. So I stopped sharing. And in the silence, I think my parents constructed their own version of my life. one in which I was perpetually on the edge of collapse, sustained by some form of family goodwill or resource they couldn't quite identify, but were certain they deserved credit for. That belief was, I think, the seed of what happened later. The trigger, when it came, was not dramatic in itself. It arrived in the form of a family dinner, my father's 68th birthday, November of the year before the lawsuit. Marcus flew in from Cleveland, Aunt Lita drove from Dayton, my cousin Adise was there with her husband. It was the kind of dinner where the table was set with the good china, and my mother had been cooking since morning. Somewhere between the jollof rice and the cake, my father made a toast. He thanked my mother. Their claim rested on 3 pillars. First, that my father had provided foundational business guidance and intellectual framework during Meridian's formation that constituted a form of uncompensated contribution. Second, that a $3,500 check my father had written to me in 2014, a birthday gift I had deposited and, in their telling, used for business expenses, represented an undisclosed equity investment. Third, that family property, specifically a storage unit registered in my father's name that I had used briefly in 2015 to store equipment during an office transition, represented an ongoing in-kind contribution to my business operations, for which they were owed compensation. I stared at the ceiling of Simone's conference room. The $3,500 was a birthday check, I said. There's a card. It says, "Happy Birthday" of Dad. I know, Simone said. We'll need the card. I had the card. I had kept it, not for legal reasons, but because it was the only birthday card my father had ever signed with the word love, and I had held on to it with the particular careful sadness of someone who collects the exceptions that prove the rule. We spent the next 14 months building our case. In reality, it was 14 months of living with a lawsuit filed by my parents hanging over every workday. Meridian was navigating a major contract renegotiation during this period. We were expanding our Dallas operation. I was hiring for 3 new senior positions simultaneously. I had a company to run, 214 people whose livelihoods depended on decisions I needed to make clearly and without static of a lawsuit my own parents had filed against me humming in the background. My operations manager, Kwame Asante, knew something was wrong. He simply started scheduling our weekly check-ins for Friday afternoons instead of Monday mornings. So you have the weekend to process anything heavy, he said. That small recalibration kept me functional. Desiree took on 2 of my scheduled client dinners without being asked. Her father, Gerald, when I told him about the lawsuit over the phone, said, "You have every document you need. I know you. You kept everything." He was right. I had kept everything. My brother Marcus called me 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. He called to tell me he thought our parents had made a mistake, and also to ask if there was any version of this that could be resolved without going to court. He was asking because he understood how much damage a public proceeding could do to a family image. I told him I had not filed this lawsuit. I told him I would defend it completely. I told him I loved him. And then I told him I couldn't keep having this conversation. He sent me a text 2 days later that said, "Whatever happens, I'm your brother. That's not on the table." I saved that text. The trial was set for a Thursday in May. I wore a charcoal blazer over a white silk blouse, pearl earrings my maternal grandmother had given me at my college graduation. I arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse at 7:45 for a 9 o'clock start. I sat in a conference room with Simone and her associate, Brandon Chu, who had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but cross-referencing every financial record. Brandon had found in that process something we hadn't initially looked for. My parents arrived at 8:50. They did not look at me in the hallway. Judge Helen Marbury presided. She was efficient and had the manner of a judge who had heard too many cases built on family grievance. Douglas Fitch gave his opening statement. Everything this young woman owns was built on stolen family capital. My father nodded at strategic intervals. Simone gave her opening statement. She was specific, organized, and brief. She laid out the timeline of Meridian's founding, the source of initial capital, the progression of revenue, and the complete absence of any financial contribution from the plaintiffs. Then Judge Marbury turned to me and asked whether I had anything to add. I stood. I adjusted my jacket. I looked directly at Douglas Fitch across the aisle. I said, "Exhibit 1. The court reporter stopped typing. Simone placed the first document in front of the judge. Exhibit 1 was the original loan agreement between myself and Gerald Washington, dated March 14, 2013, in the amount of $12,000, bearing both our signatures and a notarization. Attached to it was the repayment ledger showing every payment made, totaling $12,840, principal plus interest. Attached to that was a signed letter from Gerald Washington confirming the loan had been repaid in full and that he retained no equity in Meridian. Exhibit 2 was Meridian's original certificate of incorporation. Sole incorporator, Nadia M. Okafor Brennan. 0 co-founders, 0 listed investors. Exhibit 3 was the birthday card, a standard Hallmark card with a cardinal on the front, signed in my father's handwriting. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Love, Dad. $3,500 for whatever you need. No mention of investment, no terms, no equity. Exhibit 4 was my mother's own handwriting, a letter she had sent me in 2015, in which she referenced my business with the phrase, your little company, and expressed hope that I would eventually find something more stable. Exhibit 5 was a property records document showing that the storage unit my father had registered in his name had been listed for sale in December 2015 and transferred to a new owner in January 2016. It had not been in my father's possession for 8 years. The claim that it represented an ongoing contribution was factually impossible. Douglas Fitch objected to Exhibit 3 on grounds of relevance. Judge Marbury overruled him. Then Simone said, Your Honor, with the court's permission, the defense would like to present Exhibit 6. This was what Brandon Chu had found. Exhibit 6 was a filing from 2019 showing the incorporation of a company called Clement O. Logistics Advisory, LLC, a consulting firm registered in my father's name, which had invoiced 3 separate clients using language, service descriptions, and operational frameworks that Brandon had traced document by document to internal Meridian operational manuals I had authored between 2015 and 2017. My father had not stolen my company, but he had borrowed liberally from the documented operational methodology I had developed to build one of his own, a small one that had generated less than $200,000 in revenue and had apparently not thrived. The room was very quiet. My father looked at the document for a long time. My mother's hands tightened. Judge Marbury reviewed Exhibit 6 for 3 full minutes. Then she looked up at Douglas Fitch and said, Counsel, I'd like to understand the plaintiff's theory of the case in light of this exhibit. Fitch stood. He said any similarity in language was coincidental. Judge Marbury said, The same expertise that the complaint alleges was so uniquely foundational to the defendant's company that she owes them its entire value? Fitch had no answer for that. Court recessed for lunch. The afternoon session was shorter. Fitch called my father to the stand. My father testified with the same settled authority. He said he had provided guidance. He said the $3,500 had been intended as a business investment, and that in our family, these things are understood without paperwork. Simone's cross-examination was 6 questions. The first was, Mr. Okafor, in March 2013, did you decline to provide a $12,000 loan to your daughter for the purpose of starting Meridian Transit Solutions? My father paused. I advised against the venture at that time. Did you decline to provide the loan? Yes or no? Yes. Second question. The storage unit described in Exhibit 5, when did you last have legal ownership of that property? January 2016, I believe. So you had no ownership of this property for 8 years prior to filing this claim? No. The remaining questions addressed the birthday card, the letter my mother had written, and the operational documents in Exhibit 6. My father answered each one in a voice that grew incrementally quieter. When he stepped down, he walked past the defense table. He did not look at me, but for a single second, his pace slowed barely. Judge Marbury issued her ruling the following Tuesday. She dismissed the complaint in its entirety. She found that the plaintiffs had failed to establish any legal basis for their claim, that the $3,500 check constituted a gift, and that the storage unit claim was factually incoherent. She also assessed sanctions. Douglas Fitch's firm was ordered to pay $43,000 in defense legal fees, and my parents were ordered to pay $17,500 in court costs. I do not feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in the number. There was a kind of exhausted correctness, the way a long equation finally balances, and you feel the relief of verified accuracy. Marcus called me the night of the ruling. He said he was sorry. I said I was okay. He said, "You're not, though." I said, "No, but I will be." We talked for 40 minutes about other things. It felt like finding a room in a house you'd been locked out of and discovering it had always been unlocked. I don't know what happens with my parents. My father has not contacted me. My mother sent a text message 2 weeks after the ruling that said, "I hope you're well." I read it 7 times and did not respond. What I know is this: the $47 million is mine. Earned, documented, defensible. 14 years of supply chain routes and cold storage logistics, and 214 people showing up because the operation is sound. My father did not build that. My mother's dismissal did not build that. Gerald Washington's faith built some of it. Desiree's loyalty built some of it. Terrence's willingness to work for equity built some of it. Kwame's quiet Friday afternoon reschedules built some of it. And I built the rest. I am in my office right now. In an hour, I have a call with our Toronto operation. After that, I'm having dinner with Desiree, who is 3 months pregnant and wants my advice on maternity leave policy, which I will give her and then revise our company policy to reflect, because that is how you build something that lasts. My grandmother's pearl earrings are in a small dish on my desk. I wore them to court. I wear them on days that matter. Today matters. The 2 words were Exhibit 1, and what they meant was, I kept everything. I kept everything and I was ready. And I have been ready for longer than you knew to look. That is what I said with 2 words in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, on a Thursday in May. The court reporter stopped typing because she needed to see what came next. So did I.